With the prologue video of this series establishing the similarities between bioevolution and language evolution, we can basically just treat distinct languages just as we treat the term species. And to kick off our discussion on the particular classifications and evolution of many languages, I thought I'd start with my native tongue, English, and how it became so far apart from the other Germanic languages that shares its branch in the Indo-European tree of languages. Originating out of Proto-Germanic or the Common Germanic language circa 500 BC in the northern bit of Central Europe, the Germanic language family of Indo-European consists of three main subdivisions that began to separate from each other during the 1st or 2nd century CE, East, West, and North, all of which would influence each other just as much as they received influence from the more foreign languages they encountered. The East subdivision is comprised of the earliest offshoots of Germanic languages that began to push against the neighboring Roman Empire, spreading from mid-northern Europe towards the southern and eastern end of Europe. Of the East Germanic languages, Gothic is the most well-known, surviving up until possibly the 9th century. It and its East Germanic relatives are known today only from documents like Bible translations, however rare they may be.
I'm going to read and analyze this text something like this. Quafuf than mane sums eichter twan sununs. Ja quaf se juhisa isa tu atten, atte. Gif mis sei undrinai mic dail eigenis, ja distailde im swe sein. Ja affar ni managans dagans brachta saman alata sa juhisa sunus, ja afleif in land feira wisando, ja jainer distaihida thata swe seinata libans usturbia.
After the East Germanic started migrating southwards, the remaining Northwest Germanic-speaking people diversified into 4 large groups of dialects that then started migrating in other directions. While the Northern Germanic dialect group naturally moved upwards toward what would be Scandinavia, the former Proto-Norse language, the Elbe Germanic dialect group stayed around the Elbe River in what would be east of central Germany, where many early tribes like the Hermoines spoke dialects of Old High German, the ancestors of certain dialects of modern German, including the standard one that most non-native speakers learn today.
Quad tho summan habata zwene sunni, quad tho der jungero von theen themo Vater, Vater gib mir teil thero hechti, thiu mir gebühre, hertho teilte thia hecht, nales after manigeen tagon gisamonoten alleen der jungero son aelilentes vor, in fuera Landschaft, intidar siwar sine hech lebento wir lustigo.
The Weser Rhine dialect group settled a bit further west near what would be the Netherlands and Belgium by the 3rd century to become Old Frankish, the language spoken by the Franks, Germanic tribes that quickly made close allies with the Roman Empire, at first defending it from attacks by invaders like, wait for it, the Mongols. After some time of establishing diplomacy with the Roman Empire, the Franks then invaded the Roman region of Gaul. Ultimately, in the 4th century, the Romans had lost their Gaul region to the Franks, that they themselves had claimed from the Celtic tribes that lived there before them. I highly encourage watching the short documentary cited below if one is interested in more details about the Franks. It's really quite interesting. Not only is it from the Franks that France got its name in political consolidation, but it's their old Frankish dialects that would contribute to other dialects of modern German, in addition to the ancestor of modern French, as well as develop into modern Dutch. The last Germanic dialect group to appear after splitting from the East Germanics is the North Sea Germanic dialect group, once collectively spoken by the Ingvaevanes group of cultures that stayed the closest to the North Sea, the body of water to the west of the Nordic countries. By the 1st century BCE, the North Sea dialects had split between the languages of the ancient Frisians and that of the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. Over time, the Frisian side of the dialect group became heavily influenced and eventually consumed in its original form by neighboring Germanic languages, but the common language of the Jutes, Angles, and Saxon was able to be better preserved as they moved their way across the North Sea and into the British Isles by the 5th century, eventually displacing both the Romans and many of the native Celtic tribes by the 7th century. The language of the now dominant Jutes, Angles, and Saxons then became Old English when it gained loanwords from the cultures it displaced, namely Latin words and new letters in its written form from the Romans and some barely surviving Celtic words from the native Celts. The common language of Old English itself soon developed into 4 main spoken dialects spread across Great Britain, but the standard written form of Old English tended to be West Saxon, and that's what we read in the epic poem Beowulf.
No one knows who composed the epic Beowulf sometime between the mid-7th and end of the 10th century. It's the first great poem in the English language, the beginning of a glorious tradition which will lead to Chaucer, Shakespeare, and beyond. The poem celebrates the glory days of the Germanic tribes, epitomized in the heroic warrior who gives the poem its name. The power of the language can be heard in this passage, which introduces Beowulf's archenemy, the monster Grendel.
The comb of Mora, under Misleodum, Grendel Gongan.
In off the moors, down through the mist bands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for a prey in the high hall. Spurned and joyless, he journeyed on ahead and arrived at the bawn. Then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood.
After some time of Old English settling in its new domain on Great Britain, the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries saw the invasion of the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, hailed from Scandinavia, and with their barbaric conquering habits was their language, Old Norse, born out of the Proto-Norse dialect that had split from the West and East Germanic languages during the previous centuries. Today, their Old Norse dialect had developed into the Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Faroese languages, and Icelandic remains its closest living descendant.
Hygg ek að ek viti betur en skinheilu god og guðir sæmdu þann sið að ek skuli deyja einn og yfirgefinn.
Hvað, Óðinn eða?
Þú ert skýr maður, Þorgils, og glögg þekkin. Þáttur að vera ungum aldri fríður sínum og allur hinn kurteisasti.
Já, takk fyrir það. Ég hef nú frekar bara viljað vera skýrður Andri eða eitthvað.
Sem ég man. Okkur hefur verið boðið til hófs í búðum Þorgils Bollasonar á næsta tungli.
Hvað, eitthvað partí eða? Hóf eða? Hóf? Í hóf?
Hver veit nema vegur vor myndi mængast í veislu þeirri. Við gætum loks kongast. Kongast. Sængað hjá. Tekið á kné.
Já, það var ekki geðveikt, sko. En ég meina, fáið samt eitthvað að setja hann ef við erum alltaf í svona víkingabúningum.
Nei. Þetta er ekki bara það.
The Vikings had settled and concentrated themselves mostly around the northern part of Great Britain, and as a result, the northern dialects of Old English began to absorb a massive amount of Norse words that would soon spread and persist in the English that we use today.
All around the country over time, hundreds of Norse words entered the mainstream of English, and we still use them every day. The SK sound is a characteristic of Old Norse, and English borrowed words like score and sky and skive, as well as perhaps 1,000 others, including anger, bull, freckle, knife, neck, root, scowl, and window.
And some of these new words began being used as near synonyms with words already found in Old English, ushering in a uniquely English ability to speak with shades of meaning, like where the Old English had sick, hide, and craft, Old Norse had ill, skin, and skill. Old Norse, on top of introducing these new sets of words capable of expressing slightly different meanings, also introduced the collective pronouns they, them, and their that replaced the Old English he, him, and herra. Perhaps Old Norse's most striking legacy that changed Old English is its complete restructuring of its grammar. When Old English started out, its grammar structure was very much like modern German grammar, where the word order was mainly subject-object-verb, instead of subject-verb-object that modern English uses. Old English was very inflection-based, however, allowing the word order to not be a big deal as long as one puts the right grammatical endings on words to clearly give the proper meaning of the sentence. With the influence of Old Norse, these endings began to become more and more indistinct, forcing Old English to adapt by using prepositions before or after certain words. This in turn meant that the word order in a sentence was being more and more fixed to a certain format, such that changing the word order often meant changing the entire meaning of the sentence.
And in terms of grammar, in a way, they simplified English, didn't they? They took it away from its Germanic roots.
I think it's probably true to say that Old Norse affects the English language more than any other, because it actually leads to a restructuring of the language. Old English forms sentences, and not by word order, as we do, but by tacking on endings onto the ends of things like articles and pronouns and nouns. What happens is, through contact with a pretty similar language, a lot of these inflectional endings start to lose their distinctive nature. And actually this is a process that we can see happening fairly early on in the Anglo-Saxon period. So the language is prone to do that, but contact with Norse languages speeded it up. gave it a shove towards modernity.
Can you give us a very simple example of that?
Yes, let's take a simple sentence like, the king gave horses to his men. That would be something like in Old English, Se kuning geaf blankan his gumum. Now in Old English, you didn't tend to have a preposition like to. Instead, you could use a special ending, which kind of meant to his men. And that would be a um ending, and you just tack that onto the end of the noun for man. So you'd have gumum, ending. Now, the plural for the word for horse, if you want to say gave horses to his men, would be have an N on it, so it'd be blankan. Unfortunately, towards the end of the Old English period, we start to see that ending becoming more and more indistinct. And we see spellings like guman, an, just the same as blankan, an. And it's obvious that the king is more likely to give horses to his men than men to his horses, but you can see that there's a potential there for difficulties. And so we start to see prepositions being used in place of those endings, which had become indistinct.
Once this new Norse-influenced form of Old English spread all across Great Britain, both spoken and written, the British Isles were invaded again by French invaders in the 10th century, who spoke Old Norman, a variety of Old French that was also somewhat influenced by Vikings a few centuries before. In fact, the name Norman comes from Norsemen, describing the Viking heritage of this particular set of French people. As these now French Viking invaders implanted themselves into the late Old English culture, their immense French vocabulary gradually took root in full force in our modern English words that dealt with nearly every aspect of society.
Our words, army, archer, soldier, garrison and guard, all come from the conquering Norman French. French was the language that spelled out the architecture of the new social order: crown, throne and court, duke, baron and nobility, peasant, vassal, servant. The word govern comes from French, as do liberty, authority, obedience and traitor. The Normans took the law into their own hands. Felony, arrest, warrant, justice, judge and jury all come from French. And so do accuse, acquit, sentence, condemn, prison and jail. It's been estimated that in the 3 centuries after the conquest, about 10,000 French words colonized the English language. They didn't all come in immediately, but the conquest opened a conduit of French vocabulary that's remained open on and off ever since. Today, French words are all around us. City, market, porter.
Here we are, look, one fabulous salmon, weighs about 14 pounds. It is a fabulous fish. We've got some fabulous mackerel, they've come up from Aberdeen. Next to them are the oysters, they come from the Essex coast. Sole.
Pork, sausage, bacon.
Nice bit of fruit, bit oranges, bit juicy lemons.
Grape, tart, biscuit, sugar.
Cream.
Fry. Vinegar. Nearly 500 words dealing with food, cooking and eating alone entered English from French, just a fraction of the imports which would enrich the English word hoard in the centuries after the Norman conquest.
Once Old Norman and Old Norse vocabulary and a considerable amount of grammatical simplification began to stabilize into the Old English language, the language itself had changed so much that it marked the ushering in of Middle English. Middle English by the end of the 1400s was a language that began the trend of radical changes occurring to the language, becoming more and more distinct from its ancestral form.
The green knecht upon ground gracefully him dresses, a little lute with the head, the lair he discovers. His long lovely lockes he laid over his croon. Let the naked neck to the note schrive. Gavan gripped to his ex and Gederis hit on hecht. The K foot he on the fold he before set. Let it done lichtly licht on the naked, that the sharp of the schalk schindered the bones, and schrank thurch the sheer grace and schaddig it in twin. Set the bit of the brown stale boat on the ground, the fair head fro the house hit to the earth.
The transition from Middle English to the earliest form of modern English was set into motion by, among other factors, the Black Plague, in which most of the Anglo-Saxon peasants survived over the French nobilities, allowing them and their language to reclaim total control of British Isles, and the invention of the printing press, allowing literary works of medieval Middle English like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Bible translations to be dispersed all across Great Britain. But the lack of spelling standardization allowed the literary expression of many distinct Middle English dialects that propped up during its development, depending on the proportion of foreign language influence. Some of these varied dialects of Middle English lives on even today, like the closely linked more Scandinavian-influenced Scots language, spoken primarily in the Scotland region of Great Britain.
I would like to speak about the Scots Lead and its Sibnestil historical spearings. Firstly, what is Scots? In modern Scotland, Scots is the name for the by-leads gathered together, and is kent by the other names of Doric, Lallans and Scotch for by. And gone by where ye bide, ye micht already better ken a mere hame about name sic as Borders, Buchan, Dundonian, Glasgow or Shetland, to name a wheen. See, when gathered all together, the Scots by-leads is cried the Scots Lead. Scots is counted a branch of the Germanic family of Leads, and is, like its sister tongue Southron, sprung fae the Old Angles Lead. Both Old Angles and its dochter Scots has been spoken in Southland and Easter Scotland, the Lowlands, for the 7th century AD. There are mentions of this lead to be found, for instance, in the runic carvings on the Rivel Cross in Dumfriesshire, bigot in the 8th century AD. Scots caithed an awe in Orkney and Shetland as early as the 14th century, and got to be the most spoken tongue in the arts in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Because late Middle English at this time was so varied in vocabulary and pronunciation, there had not yet been any standard written form of English, so when it came to writing it, different dialects spelled words in different ways.
Across the country, people still spoke a mass of different dialects and would have had trouble understanding one another. For instance, the word stien or stain in the north was stone in the south. The ing participle, as in running, was said as and in the north, end in the East Midlands, and ind in the West Midlands. So, running could also be said as runand, runind, and runend. But that was nothing compared to the variety of spellings in use. Because England had traditionally used French or Latin as its written languages, there had never been any need to agree on a common linguistic standard or even how to spell particular words. But now, there was.
In light of this need for English spelling to be standardized so that everyone in Great Britain can communicate regardless of dialect, successful Middle English words like the Canterbury Tales helped establish the London dialect of Middle English as a standard pronunciation, and with some modifications, it also became the standard for spelling.
And a desire to make the roots of the language more evident, words that had entered English from French, for instance, were given a Latin look. The letter B was inserted into debt and doubt, the letter C into victuals. Words that were thought to be of Greek origin sometimes had their spelling adjusted, so that throne and theatre acquired their H. Rhyme, on the other hand, was given an H just because rhythm had one, even though it's etymologically absurd. On a similar principle, an L was inserted in could because it had become silent, but it was still present in should and would. The same with H in words like whole, were, and welk. And like anybody who tries to rationalize English, they really messed it up.
The standards of English spelling were made around the 1500s, a time when English was still being modified with loan words, and a change in English pronunciation was underway that was so profound it's dubbed the Great Vowel Shift. While the Great Vowel Shift didn't affect all sounds in all dialects, it is what's largely responsible for why English has a standard spelling that doesn't always reflect its pronunciation, especially when it comes to homophones, because the standard spellings were decided before the changes in pronunciation took place.
As if to prove the folly of trying to bring reason into the language, the English promptly decided to pronounce everything differently anyway. Around this time, and nobody really knows why, a sea change took place in the way English sounds. This is called the Great Vowel Shift, and it happened comparatively quickly. We think over a generation or two. Before it, English was pronounced in a way that sounds foreign to us now. Might used to sound rather like today's meat, which in turn was said something like mit. So the sentence, I might go and buy some meat, once sounded like, I meet, go and buy some mit. That was the great vowel shift. It made 15th century English recognisable to the modern ear, but it didn't change the spelling.
Once the standard written variety of late Middle English was established, then it's thought that that marked the point at which it became early modern English, which was continuing to be influenced by the continuing great vowel shift. And when the first dictionaries were being written in the beginning of the 1600s, more and more people were able to be educated through English, and the pronunciation became more and more streamlined, to finally form what would be generally considered modern English, largely as it stands today. All through this transition from Middle English to modern English, loanwords, especially those associated with travel, continued to be absorbed from Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and French. More words also started coming in from Arabic, Italian, Latin, and Greek as well, as Europe continued into the climax of the European Renaissance. The rise of the early modern English period was also the time of Shakespeare, and modern English inherited even more richness from his own inventions like assassination, metamorphosed, and cold-blooded, allowing English to be so vividly expressive to the point where the study of English rhetoric became a legit thing, and English poetry, playwriting, and other literary media became appreciated by many other cultures outside of Great Britain. They may as well have appreciated it because this was a language that was going to be taken overseas as the British Empire expanded across the Atlantic during the 1700s and 1800s. Words continued to flow in as New World cultures mingled with the English of their time, plus new inventions and innovations are engineered, causing and caused by the Industrial Revolution, and the rest is recent history. English, as well as many other languages that persist today, continues to change as we invent new words for new concepts that we experience and teach others, where even some forms of English have already started diverging today, like the English Pidgin and Creole languages that exist in the various parts of the U.S.
As well as vocabulary, Gullah employs some grammatical features that differ from standard English.
If someone say, "How are you going to do that?" I be done to them. Okay? So they ask you, "Are you going to do it?" I already did it. And I did it a long time ago, essentially, is what you're saying. I be done to them. I done do that. You see? So if you hear somebody say, "I done do that," that means they did it and they did it a long time ago. And why are you asking me? Oh, again, basically. So it's a lot more going into it. So if someone said, "Well, Hunter are going over there," Hunter done yet, they say, "You're going over there." I be done yet that. But it done do that too. But I been going there, but they ain't be did it. Why Hunter ain't be did it? When I be did it, Hunter ain't be did it. You see? So it's like, well, you were going over there. Yeah, I already went there. But when I went, you weren't there. But I was there. But you're right. I wasn't there when you were there.
Phrases like these have a rich and economical expressiveness. In other ways, Gullah and other black Englishes have stripped down their grammar. They drop verbs like is, use don't where standard English says doesn't, and omit the apostrophe and s that standard English uses as a sign of ownership. This kind of simplification is common when languages meet and emerge as a new hybrid. It's exactly what happened when Saxons and Danes dealt with each other in England in the 9th century and changed English grammar forever. But in this case, the changes were mistakenly taken by many white observers as evidence that black speakers just hadn't got the intelligence to speak the language properly, that they were simply trying and failing to copy white speech. In fact, they were adding to the language.
And just as every person of every language before us, every one of us today offers a unique way for English to be expressed, and given the right circumstances, we could potentially carve our own subset of English that future linguists might find just as fascinating as we might have found our Germanic cousins or any of our ancestors to be.
Blauet säden, blauet med ett smink och